taken some speaking notes, about 2 or 3 questions, which I would just like to address. And the first one is, what practical solutions are we able to to adopt to create improvements and lower prices? Jibril and Amadou and Don, they've done an excellent work. But let me just quickly recap some of it and then elaborate to say we will need to continue. If we want to bring down the cost of remittances, we need to have more outlets for remittance flows. And this might involve community banks or post offices and others, until we're able to bring remittances to the doorstep of the recipients in terms of the so many outlets. Technology, as we have seen, the banks and others are struggling to catch up. Most of them still operate under the archaic legislations of the 60s and others. But I know that with with technology, we will be able to do that thanks to the pioneering work of M-Pesa and others. But please don't use your remittances for M-Pesa Bet and Premier League that is now in Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana. Beware of that. But they've been pioneers, and I believe they're also pioneering that in Africa. But above all, it's the change in regulatory framework, and here we need to be vigilant. If we want more outlets, if we want more technology, then we need to continue to change the regulatory framework. The World Bank and others have they've done a kind of a pioneering work, but it's nice listening to Don says he doesn't trust the World Bank figures, but I've seen him working with Swahili now, giving us those figures. But the point here is, as countries in Africa face problem of exchange, and we almost see that in Nigeria, who did a pioneering work in changing the regulatory framework, they were almost going to slide back into where they were coming from. You recall Leon when we were in Harare a couple of months back, but I'm glad they've done some policy somersault, and thanks to the mobilization, how all those in the field mobilized to have serious dialogue. So we will still need to improve the regulatory framework, and we are far from being done. Unless we do that, and this will now bring me into the some of the what I've listened to in terms of capacity building, whether for central banks or for whoever is responsible. As I listen around, I'm also a little bit afraid that there are too many people doing different things here and there. I've listened to IOM, I've listened to some presentations here and there. I know, I recall in this same, no, it wasn't in Nairobi, but in Kenya, here, where were we in November last year? And when in Naivasha, when we had that IOM is working with central bank, and everybody said, excuse me, since when has IOM started giving capacity building to the central, what do you call them? The World Bank people were a little bit appalled, and for me, it's all about ensuring synergy. Anyone can give capacity building to whoever, but we should not go on to repeat what has been done. If there is no proper synergy, what we're going to have is, just like I read, Central Bank of Somalia, and I'm wondering, does it exist? Please forgive me, maybe it exists on paper, so I'll be wondering, whom are you going to support in terms of central banks of Somalia or Liberia? I mean, we had that of Liberia, which is okay. But the point here is, if we really want to bring down the cost of remittances, we must, all of us in this room, in this era of scarce resources, harmonize what we're doing so that we can get meaningful results. And I think this forum provides us with that opportunity. If we don't do that, then we'll be repeating the same thing 5 years to come. And as Don has clearly told us, it is the measurements that continues to improve. it's not as if more recipients will still be back to where we are unless we harmonize what we are doing. But this brings us to what we are doing in AU in terms of practical steps and the coming on board of the Remittances Institute. As you've heard from the Interim Executive Secretary this morning, doing what we call 3 or 4 practical things. They'll be conducting research in data gathering, and thanks to the Send Money Africa, because it's when you have evidence driven that you can then present this to those who are supposed to open remittances outlets all over the place. 2, the Institute will also be able to give capacity building, leveraging the existing efforts that they have, but also conduct advocacy. Because as we've heard from Jibril and others, unless we're able to bring people into dialogue, I was going to interrupt Don to say, what about the role of Putin in in Russia? Couldn't Putin have decreed that I don't want it to be more than this amount? The AIR has started engaging the associations of the governors of central bank, and I believe we should see tremendous improvement as they engage the central bank governors into how do we practically bring down the cost of remittance flow. I have absolute confidence in this. When Jibril said, look, I can go into the streets of New York and bring it to 1%, well, it's right in a way, because with a stroke of a pen, if we really want to do it, it can be done. And I believe our Remittances Institute is doing that. One other thing, in terms of practical steps that we're doing at the continental level, and I always like to cite the example of Mexico here and the United States. When you allow undocumented and irregular migrants, when you give them access to the financial system, it will achieve 2 things. It will bring more into the financial system rather than informal. And 2, the more volume you have, it's likely going to bring down the price. So it's gratifying to know that some time ago in South Africa, they allow undocumented migrants to be able to use the financial system. And I believe it might have, in a way, contributed to the lowering. It's still very high, but I can assure that if you see the data 5 years ago between Malawi and South Africa, it's over around 19%. Maybe today is about 8%, or between 8 and 10%. So when they did that, it no doubt sort of increased the volume, like I said. But at continental level, the African Union, the remittance data that we've all had here, that most of the migratory flow is within Africa. The remittances, as we heard from Amadou and others, it's also forcing us to have a rethink at the continental level in terms of improving mobility. Because if we improve mobility, and there is no issue of you be whether documented or irregular on the continent, then we are likely going to witness more people going into remittance flow, into the financial system, and lowering. By 2018, we're expecting to have the treaty, the continental treaty on free movement of persons. So this, it should not escape our sight, the efforts that the African Union is making. And this was started in Johannesburg, and I can keep citing the relevant assembly decisions. But the second continental step we're taking is to create a large free trade area, the continental free trade area on the continent. And I always like to link the issue of trade with migration and with remittances. When you have a larger space, you create prosperity. If we can create prosperity on the continent, as we are hoping to do, well, we'll reduce, like we've had here, more people always stay at home. And when there is prosperity within the continent, then the issue of migratory flow reduces, the cost of remittance flow will also hopefully reduce. So please join us in creating prosperity on the continent. And to do so, we're going to invite all our partners, particularly those who perceive the current crisis, that unless we increase prosperity in Africa, then we will not, we continue to have perhaps people perishing in Lampedusa, and unless Europe is prepared to abandon some of its protectionist policies, because we cannot have continental free trade area. I always like to recall with nostalgia that when the Americans offered Europe the Marshall Plan, it's not just about money. Key to the Marshall Plan then was Europe. We have a single market. We continue to create a single market that they can sell into the United States, while the United States allowed them to have some measure of protectionism. What we have today, in the case of us in Africa, is a reverse. Well, Europe is helping in so many ways, but it's like giving you something with your right hand, and you take it back with the left hand. So unless we remove protectionism and really create prosperity on this continent, then we will not really tackle the issue of the so-called irregular migratory flow. Or, let's face it, the remittances that we are all talking about here, we will get more within the continent, and we need more within the continent than those that are coming from Europe. Then if I move on to what can the international organization do, this is the second question that I really want to address. And it's gratifying to know that I have had people making reference to the SDGs. Particularly for me, I had Swahila. I'm going to be more focusing on the SDG 10. 10.7 in particular, that's talking about to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. Well, I don't know how we're going to do that, but it's an SDG goal to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. This is one area that the international community can do. But if we do not facilitate legal migration, then we're going to have irregular migration. Right now, I'm not very much aware, particularly between our partners, Europe and Africa, how well are we facilitating regular migration, even in line with 10.7. All I can say is that we are trying to do that within Africa, like I've explained earlier, in terms of our continental mobility and free movement of persons, and continue to give capacity building to our member states. Article 10, Goal 10.10, Jibril, you're right to some extent, but if you read Goals 10.10, it's talking of to reduce to less than 3%. So the key operative word for me is less than 3%. It's an aspiration, and I did agree with you as one of the negotiators of Valletta that indeed we were able to bring that to 2020. Again, this is one of the things that at the international level we can try to do to continue to galvanize support in an attempt to bring down the cost of remittances, well-managed migration, reducing the cost of remittance flow. I recognize the work that you're trying to do, particularly in Valletta. We did identify that the German corridor, one of the most expensive, but according to the statistics that Leon has provided us some time ago, we've also begun to see that the German corridor is beginning to slow down, particularly between Nigeria and Germany. But quite a lot still needs to be done, and we have also taken the dialogue to the German Parliament just about 2 weeks ago, that with constant dialogue amongst all the partners and those responsible, we can actually bring down the cost of remittances. I want to stop here so that in case of other time when we have more questions. But before I go, I want to touch on another thing finally in terms of what the African Union is doing, because I have my commissioner here and we must tell the whole world what we are doing. It's related to remittances. It's the Joint Labor Migration Program. It's part of the effort that we are also doing, recognizing the that most of migration takes place on this continent, recognizing the fact that I think it's the third now, North America, Europe, North America, the remittance flow within the continent is the third largest and is growing and more consistent. Our folks, our diaspora, don't send money home as regularly as those within the continent. When they do, yes, they send huge sums of money, so that's why the flow is still very high. But in terms of consistency, it is within. The Joint Labor Migration Program aims at actually not just improving mobility of labor, but has its eyes on the securities, on social security of the migrant workers. It has its eyes on getting us the adequate and accurate statistics so that we can expand opportunities on the continent. I invite all of you to check out our GLMP, because it's part of the efforts that, and when I say joint, we didn't include World Bank this time around. We didn't include Labad, their junior brother, AFDB. But it's a joint program of the AU, ECA, and ILO. Is there any other fourth one? I said IOM and IOM, yes. See, we decide to exclude those two, Labad, Labank Mondial, because. So I invite you to look at GLMP as another dimension of what we are trying to do to improve the lots of mobility, as well as to improve the cost of remittance flow on the continent. Thank you very much.